The whistling of a lone bullet cut through the silence as Xander Masterson dropped to the ground, his weathered face pressed against the coarse desert soil. Arizona Territory, 1878, another day, another ambush. He had been riding alone for so long that solitude felt like an old, familiar companion. Danger, its faithful shadow. Xander's calloused hand reached for his Winchester rifle, fingers curling around the worn wooden stock as he gauged the distance between himself and the outcropping of rocks where the shooter had taken position. Sunlight glinted off his silver spurs as he rolled behind the meager shelter of his fallen horse, a pang of sorrow for the animal mingling with his instinct for survival. "Might as well show yourself," Xander called out, his voice rough from days of little use and too much dust. "Ain't carrying nothing worth dying over." The silence stretched, broken only by the soft desert breeze carrying tumbleweeds across the barren landscape. At 35, Xander had spent nearly half his life riding from town to town, taking odd jobs as a ranch hand, occasional bounty hunter, and sometimes reluctant peacekeeper. The Civil War had left him with nightmares and a restlessness that prevented him from staying in one place too long. A shot rang out again, splintering the wood of a nearby cactus. Xander returned fire, his aim true as it always was. A cry of pain echoed across the desert expanse, followed by the sound of retreating hoofbeats. Bandits likely thinking a lone rider would be easy pickings. They had chosen the wrong man. Xander stood slowly, dusting off his denim pants and worn leather vest. His steel-gray eyes scanned the horizon, making sure the danger had truly passed. With a heavy sigh, he approached his fallen horse, confirming what he already knew: the animal wouldn't survive the wound. With a steady hand and a heavy heart, Xander ended the loyal creature's suffering with a single shot. "Sorry, old friend," he murmured, removing his saddle and gathering what supplies he could carry. The nearest town was Steins Pass, New Mexico, perhaps a day's walk if he pushed himself. With the desert sun beating down mercilessly, Xander adjusted his wide-brimmed hat and began walking, the weight of solitude heavier than his pack. By nightfall, Xander had covered considerable ground, his steps leaving trails in the desert sand that would be gone with the morning wind. He made camp in a small ravine, building a modest fire that would provide enough warmth without drawing unwanted attention. As he chewed on jerky and sipped water from his canteen, Xander gazed up at the stars, their brilliance undiminished by the artificial lights that would come to dominate the sky in future generations. Sleep came fitfully, as it always did. Memories of battles long past, of comrades lost, and of a family he had left behind in Tennessee before the war intertwined with the sounds of the desert night. Xander had made peace with his solitary existence years ago, or so he told himself in moments of quiet reflection. The truth was more complicated. He had never found a place that felt like home, never met someone who made him want to put down roots. Dawn broke with its characteristic desert beauty, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. Xander resumed his journey, calculating that he would reach Steins Pass by mid-afternoon if his pace remained steady. The town had sprung up around the railroad, a common enough story in these parts, and Xander had passed through once before, perhaps 3 years earlier. He remembered little of it beyond the usual saloon and general store. The sun was high when Xander spotted the settlement in the distance, a collection of wooden buildings shimmering like a mirage on the horizon. As he drew closer, he could make out the steeple of a small church, the rectangular shape of storefronts, and the inevitable saloon with its swinging doors. What Xander didn't expect was the commotion visible even from his vantage point some distance away. A crowd had gathered in what passed for the town square, voices raised in what sounded like anger. Instinct told him to bypass the trouble, to skirt around and find a quieter entry point. Yet something curiosity, perhaps, or that nagging sense of justice that had followed him since his youth drew him toward the disturbance. As he approached, the scene became clearer. A woman stood defiantly before what appeared to be the town sheriff, and several men who had positioned themselves around her like a human barricade. 2 children clung to her skirts, a boy of perhaps 7 or 8, and a smaller girl who couldn't have been more than 5. "I don't care what arrangements my husband made," the woman was saying, her voice steady despite her obvious distress. "This land is rightfully mine, and I intend to work it." "Mrs. Calloway," the sheriff replied, his tone condescending, "a woman alone can't manage that ranch. Clayton's debts are considerable, and Mr. Hargrove here has made a generous offer." "An offer that's less than half what the property is worth," she shot back. "Generous to whom, Sheriff Barrett?" Xander paused at the edge of the gathering, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. The woman was striking, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, though several strands had escaped to frame her face. Her dress was simple but clean, the fabric worn at the edges from repeated washing. The children were similarly dressed in clothes that had been mended multiple times. "Mrs. Calloway, be reasonable," a well-dressed man, presumably Hargrove, interjected. "Your husband's been dead less than a month. You have these children to consider. The offer stands until sundown, then I withdraw it completely." "My answer remains no," the woman said firmly. "Come, Thomas, Elizabeth." She turned, guiding her children through the crowd, her back straight despite the weight of stares following her. Xander found himself stepping aside as she passed, their eyes meeting briefly. Hers were a deep brown, filled with determination and barely contained fear. She nodded slightly in acknowledgement of his courtesy before continuing on her way. The crowd dispersed slowly, murmurs of disapproval and concern following in the woman's wake. Xander overheard snippets of conversation, how Jasmine Calloway was being stubborn and foolish, how she couldn't possibly manage a ranch alone, how her children would suffer for her pride. With a shrug that was more habit than indifference, Xander made his way to the general store. He needed supplies before considering his next move, and perhaps the storekeeper could direct him to work. His funds were running low. The bell above the door jingled as Xander entered, the familiar smell of leather, tobacco, and coffee greeting him. The proprietor, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his ledger. "Afternoon, stranger," the man said, assessing Xander with practiced eyes. "What can I help you with? Need some supplies?" Xander replied, placing his hat on the counter. "And information about work, if there's any to be had." The storekeeper, who introduced himself as Martin Olson, nodded sagely as he gathered Xander's requested items. "Ammunition, tobacco, coffee, and basic foodstuffs. Looking for permanent work or just passing through?" Olson asked. "Just passing through," Xander answered automatically, the words so familiar they required no thought. "Well, there's always need for hands at the ranches around here," Olson said, wrapping Xander's purchases in brown paper. "Though I'd steer clear of the Calloway place if I were you." "The woman I saw in the square," Olson nodded. "Jasmine Calloway. Husband died of fever 3 weeks back, left her with 2 young'uns and a ranch that was already struggling. Hargrove's been trying to buy that land for years. It sits on a good water source. Clayton Calloway borrowed heavy to keep it going, and now those debts have come due." Xander counted out coins for his purchases. "Seems like a determined woman." "Determined won't feed cattle or fix fences," Olson replied with a shake of his head. "She's got maybe a month before the bank forecloses anyway. Shame about those children. With a noncommittal grunt, Xander gathered his supplies and stepped back into the harsh sunlight. His immediate need was a horse, then lodging for the night. Tomorrow he would seek work, earn enough to continue his journey northward. That had been the plan before he entered town, and he saw no reason to alter it. Yet as he secured a room at the modest hotel and later nursed a whiskey at the saloon, Xander found his thoughts returning to Jasmine Calloway and her children. Their situation wasn't his concern. He had learned long ago that involving himself in others' troubles only led to complications. Still, something about the woman's defiance in the face of overwhelming odds struck a chord. The next morning, instead of inquiring at the larger ranches surrounding Stein's Pass, Xander found himself riding a newly purchased mare toward the Calloway property. He justified the detour as simple curiosity, perhaps mixed with a practical assessment of potential work. If the widow needed help and could offer even modest pay, it might serve his purposes before he moved on. The Calloway Ranch sat in a small valley about 5 miles outside town, the modest house and barn showing signs of neglect that predated Clayton Calloway's recent death. As Xander approached, he noted the broken corral fence, the weathered roof in need of repair, and the small herd of cattle grazing on sparse vegetation. It wasn't the worst operation he'd seen, but it clearly needed work. Before he could reach the house, Xander spotted movement near the barn. The boy, Thomas, was struggling to lift a heavy feed bag. Without dismounting, Xander redirected his horse toward the child. "Need a hand with that," he called out. Thomas startled, dropping the bag and reaching for a nearby pitchfork with surprising speed for one so young. "Stay back," the boy warned, his voice cracking slightly. "My ma's got a shotgun and she knows how to use it." Xander raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. "I believe it," he said calmly. "Just offering help. Saw you in town yesterday." Before the boy could respond, Jasmine Calloway emerged from the barn, the promised shotgun indeed in her hands. She looked even more exhausted in the morning light, dark circles beneath her eyes suggesting sleepless nights. "Thomas, go inside with your sister," she ordered, her gaze never leaving Xander. "But Ma, now, Thomas." Her tone brooked no argument, and the boy reluctantly retreated to the house, casting suspicious glances over his shoulder. "Mrs. Calloway," Xander said, tipping his hat. "Xander Masterson. I'm looking for work." Jasmine's grip on the shotgun didn't waver. "Mr. Masterson, if Hargrove sent you, nobody sent me," Xander interrupted. "I need work, you need help, simple as that." A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. "I can't pay much, barely enough to feed my children right now." "Room, board, and what you can spare," Xander suggested. "I'm a fair hand with cattle and can fix most anything broken." "Why?" Jasmine asked bluntly. "Every other man in town thinks I should sell. Why would you help?" Xander considered the question, finding no easy answer. He'd spent years avoiding attachments, moving on whenever a place started to feel too familiar. Yet here he was, offering to stay. "Been riding alone a long time," he finally said. "Maybe I'm tired of it. Maybe I just don't like seeing someone backed into a corner. Does it matter?" Jasmine studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she lowered the shotgun slightly. 2 weeks, she said. "I'll give you 2 weeks' trial. First sign of trouble, you're gone." Xander nodded, dismounting smoothly. "Fair enough." And so began a partnership born of necessity and circumstance, neither party fully trusting the other, both aware of the precarious nature of their arrangement. Jasmine showed Xander to the bunkhouse, a small structure attached to the barn that had housed ranch hands in better times. It was dusty from disuse, but otherwise sound, with a narrow bed, a small stove, and a single window overlooking the corral. That first day set the pattern for those that followed. Xander rose before dawn, tending to his own horse and the few remaining work animals before checking the cattle. Jasmine would emerge from the house as the sun crested the horizon, often with coffee and simple but filling breakfast. They would discuss the day's tasks, their conversation strictly practical, before setting to work. The children watched Xander warily at first, especially Thomas, who had clearly appointed himself his mother's protector in his father's absence. Elizabeth, the younger child, observed from a distance with solemn eyes that seemed too old for her 5 years. By the end of the first week, Xander had repaired the corral fence, patched the worst of the roof leaks, and begun the process of reinforcing the barn's weather-damaged support beams. He worked methodically, his movements economical and practiced. Occasionally, he would look up to find Thomas observing him, the boy's expression a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "You want to help?" Xander asked one afternoon as he split logs for fence posts. Thomas hesitated before stepping forward. "I know how," he said defensively. "Pa showed me." Xander nodded, handing the boy a smaller axe. "Your pa teach you about measuring twice before cutting?" "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, his grip on the axe betraying his inexperience despite his claim. "Show me," Xander said, stepping back slightly. What followed was a quiet lesson in woodcraft, Xander correcting Thomas's form with minimal words and demonstrating proper technique. By the time Jasmine called them for the midday meal, the boys' initial wariness had given way to grudging respect. "You're good with him," Jasmine observed that evening as they sat on the porch, the children already asleep inside. It was the first personal comment she had made since Xander's arrival. "He's a good kid," Xander replied, rolling a cigarette with practiced fingers. "Trying hard to be the man of the house." "Too hard," Jasmine sighed. "He's still a child, but since Clayton." She trailed off, looking toward the distant mountains. Xander lit his cigarette, the match flaring briefly in the gathering darkness. "How long were you married?" he asked, surprising himself with the personal question. 9 years, Jasmine answered after a moment. "We came west from Missouri right after. Clayton had dreams of building something lasting." A sad smile touched her lips. "He wasn't much of a rancher, truth be told. Tried hard, but luck was never on our side. Bad winters, cattle disease, drought seemed like the land itself was against us." "Why stay?" Xander asked. Jasmine's expression hardened slightly. "This is my children's birthplace, their heritage. Clayton might have failed at ranching, but he loved this land. I won't let Hargrove or anyone else take it from them." Xander nodded, understanding the fierce protection of something that was more than property. It was legacy, identity. He had abandoned such connections long ago, or thought he had. The second week brought new challenges. Word had spread in Stein's Pass that the Calloway widow had hired help, and Hargrove made an appearance, ostensibly to renew his offer for the property. Xander was repairing a water pump when the businessman arrived in his polished buggy. "Mrs. Calloway," Hargrove called, his voice carrying the false warmth of practiced charm. "I see you've made improvements." His gaze settled on Xander, assessing, "and acquired assistance." Jasmine emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Hargrove, my answer hasn't changed." Hargrove smiled thinly. "Perhaps not, but circumstances will, Mrs. Calloway. The bank is quite firm about the deadline for your husband's loan. One hired hand won't change the arithmetic." Xander straightened, his hand instinctively moving closer to the revolver at his hip. Something about Hargrove's tone suggested more than business interest in the property. "Mr. Hargrove was just leaving," Jasmine said firmly, stepping between the two men. The businessman's smile didn't reach his eyes. Indeed I was, but I'll be back, Mrs. Calloway. When the bank forecloses, my offer won't be nearly as generous. He tipped his hat mockingly before climbing back into his buggy. As the dust from Hargrove's departure settled, Xander turned to Jasmine. He seems determined. The water rights, Jasmine explained, her voice tight with anger. Our property controls access to the best spring in the county. Hargrove owns the largest ranch in the territory and wants to expand. He's been trying to buy us out for years. And the bank loan? Xander asked. Jasmine's shoulders slumped slightly. Due at the end of the month. Clayton borrowed against the property last winter after we lost half our herd to disease. I have some savings, but not enough. That evening, after the children were asleep, Jasmine brought out a small tin box and spread its contents on the kitchen table. Xander watched as she counted coins and the few paper bills, her face growing more despondent with each tally. Short by nearly $200, she finally said, pushing the money away in frustration. Even if we sell some cattle, it won't be enough. Xander considered the situation. $200 was a significant sum, not easily acquired through legitimate means in such a short time. He had some money saved, the result of years of frugal living, but not enough to cover the shortfall. There might be another way, he said slowly. The cattle drive to Santa Fe leaves next week. They're always short of experienced hands and the pay is good. You'd be gone for weeks, Jasmine pointed out, and the payment is due before you'd return. Not if I can convince them to advance wages, Xander replied. It's been done before for men with families. The word hung between them, families. Xander wasn't family. He was a hired hand who had appeared less than 2 weeks ago. Yet somehow the distinction felt less clear than it should have. I could talk to the trail boss tomorrow, Xander suggested. See what can be arranged. Jasmine studied him, her expression a mixture of hope and wariness. Why would you do this? You barely know us. It was the question Xander had been asking himself since he first rode onto the Calloway property. The answer remained elusive, yet he found himself increasingly unwilling to simply ride away as he had from countless other places. Maybe I'm tired of not having a reason to stay somewhere, he finally said, the admission surprising him almost as much as it seemed to surprise Jasmine. The following day, Xander rode into Stein's Pass to speak with the trail boss of the upcoming cattle drive. Jacob Miller was a grizzled veteran of such expeditions, his weathered face testament to years under the harsh western sun. He listened to Xander's proposition with narrowed eyes. Calloway Place, eh? Miller mused, chewing on a toothpick. Heard the widow was having troubles, also heard she's got herself a new hand. He gave Xander an appraising look. That'd be you, I reckon. Just helping out, Xander replied neutrally. She's in a tight spot. Miller nodded slowly. Could use an experienced man like yourself. Might be willing to advance some wages given the circumstances. Not the full amount, mind you, but something to help the widow along. Relief coursed through Xander, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. Appreciate it. As he turned to leave, Miller called after him. Masterson, word of advice from someone who's been around these parts longer than most. Be careful with Hargrove. Man doesn't take kindly to being denied something he wants. Xander acknowledged the warning with a nod before mounting his horse. The ride back to the ranch gave him time to consider Miller's words and the growing complexity of his involvement with the Calloway family. What had begun as a temporary arrangement was evolving into something deeper, a commitment that contradicted years of deliberate detachment. Upon his return, Xander found Jasmine and the children in the vegetable garden behind the house. Elizabeth was carefully placing seeds in small furrows while Thomas hauled water from the nearby well. The domesticity of the scene struck Xander with unexpected force. This was what normal life looked like, what putting down roots meant. "Mr. Masterson," Elizabeth called out, her initial shyness having given way to cautious friendship over the past weeks. "Look at my carrots." Xander dismounted, approaching the garden with a smile that felt unfamiliar on his face. "Fine planting, Miss Elizabeth. Those will be some mighty carrots come harvest." Jasmine straightened, brushing soil from her hands. "How did it go in town?" "Miller agreed to advance some wages," Xander reported. "Not enough to cover everything, but it will help." Relief flooded Jasmine's face, followed quickly by determination. "We'll make up the difference somehow. Perhaps I can sell some of my mother's silver." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson, Xander found himself sharing stories of his travels, tales he had rarely told anyone. He spoke of the majestic forests of the Pacific Northwest, the vast plains of Texas, the rugged mountains of Colorado. Jasmine listened intently, occasionally asking questions that revealed her own dreams of seeing places beyond the confines of Stein's Pass. "Clayton always promised we'd travel someday," she said wistfully. "After the ranch was established, after the children were older, after the next good season." She sighed. There was always an after that never came. "There's still time," Xander said, surprising himself with the sentiment. "The children are young, you're young." Jasmine looked at him directly, the fading light softening her features. "I'm 31, Mr. Masterson." "Hardly young by frontier standards." "Xander," he corrected gently, "and you're younger than me by a few years." A small smile curved her lips. "Xander, then." She hesitated before adding, "Will you return after the cattle drive?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Xander had never planned to return to any place, had deliberately avoided creating connections that would make leaving difficult. "Yes," he said simply. "I'll return." The preparations for Xander's departure consumed the next few days. The cattle drive would last at least 3 weeks, possibly longer depending on conditions. In his absence, Jasmine would need to manage the ranch alone, a daunting prospect despite the repairs and improvements Xander had made during his stay. Thomas shadowed Xander constantly, absorbing every instruction about maintaining the repaired equipment, caring for the animals, and handling basic emergencies. The boy's initial hostility had transformed into something approaching hero worship, a change that both pleased and concerned Xander. He had never considered himself anyone's role model. The night before his departure, after the children were asleep, Jasmine presented Xander with a small package wrapped in cloth. "For the journey," she explained as he unwrapped it to reveal freshly baked biscuits and a small jar of preserved peaches. "Not much, but—" "Thank you," Xander said, genuinely touched by the gesture. In all his years of wandering, few had offered such kindness without expectation of return. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken thoughts and emerging feelings neither was prepared to articulate. Finally, Jasmine spoke. "Be careful," she said simply. "The children would be disappointed if—" She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "Only the children?" Xander asked softly. Jasmine met his gaze, her expression vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before. "No," she admitted. "Not only the children." The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility. Xander had not allowed himself to consider a future that included staying in one place, becoming part of a family. Yet standing there in the quiet kitchen, with Jasmine looking at him as if he mattered, as if his presence made a difference, the idea no longer seemed impossible. "I'll return," he promised again, the words carrying more weight than any commitment he had made in years. Dawn came too quickly. the sky barely lightening as Xander prepared to ride to the meeting point for the cattle drive. Thomas was already awake, solemnly helping to saddle Xander's horse while reciting the list of daily chores he had committed to memory. "And check the north fence every other day," the boy said earnestly, "and the water level in the well." "You'll do fine," Xander assured him, tightening the saddle cinch. "Your ma will need your help," Thomas nodded seriously. "I'll protect them while you're gone." The simple statement, delivered with such earnest determination, caught Xander by surprise. The boy had accepted him as a protector, a role Xander had never sought, but now found himself reluctant to relinquish. Jasmine emerged from the house with Elizabeth, both dressed despite the early hour. The little girl clutched a small wooden horse that Xander had carved for her from a scrap of lumber. "Remember your promise," Elizabeth said solemnly as Xander knelt to her level. "To bring back a story about the trail?" Xander asked, smiling at the child's serious expression. She nodded emphatically. "A good one, with adventures." "The best adventure I can find," Xander agreed, lightly tapping her nose and earning a rare giggle. Standing to face Jasmine was harder. Her expression contained a mixture of gratitude, worry, and something deeper that neither of them had yet defined. "Miller's advance should help with immediate expenses," Xander said, deliberately focusing on practical matters. "And I've arranged with Olson at the general store to extend credit if needed." "We'll manage," Jasmine assured him. "You've already done more than—" She paused, composing herself. "More than anyone else would have." Impulsively, Xander reached out, taking her hand briefly. The contact was fleeting but electric, a connection that transcended words. Without allowing himself to overthink, Xander mounted his horse and rode away, the sensation of Jasmine's hand lingering on his skin like a promise. The cattle drive proved as grueling as Xander had anticipated. 200 head of cattle, 8 cowboys including himself, and a cook made up the outfit heading to Santa Fe. Days stretched into nights of constant vigilance, battling dust, thirst, and the ever-present threat of stampede. Yet throughout the exhausting journey, Xander found his thoughts continually returning to the Calloway ranch and the family awaiting his return. Miller proved true to his word, advancing Xander a portion of his wages before they departed Stein's Pass. This, combined with what Jasmine had managed to save, would help address the immediate debt, but left little margin for future expenses. As they drove the cattle northward, Xander mentally calculated how much additional money would be needed to secure the ranch's future more permanently. Halfway through the journey, as they made camp near a small stream, Miller approached Xander, who was keeping first watch over the resting herd. "You're different than I figured," the trail boss commented, offering Xander a cup of coffee. "How's that?" Xander asked, accepting the steaming brew gratefully. Miller settled beside him, the firelight casting deep shadows across his weathered features. "Known your type before. Drifters. Men who can't or won't stay put. Usually there's something driving them, law, women, memories." He studied Xander thoughtfully. "But you're riding toward something now, not away." Xander said nothing, the observation uncomfortably accurate. For years, he had defined himself by his ability to leave, to avoid attachment. Now, with each mile that separated him from Stein's Pass, he felt an unfamiliar pull, a desire to return that grew stronger rather than diminishing with distance. "Calloway widow's a fine woman," Miller continued, seemingly unperturbed by Xander's silence. "Shame about her husband. Clayton was a decent sort, just not cut out for ranching. Too soft-hearted to make the hard decisions." "You knew him well?" Xander asked, curious about the man whose shoes he found himself increasingly filling. Miller shrugged. "Well enough." Everyone knows everyone in these parts, one way or another. Clayton came from back east, had book learning but no practical sense. Jasmine was the one with the real strength, though Clayton never fully realized it. The conversation shifted to other topics: the condition of the herd, weather prospects, the potential price they might fetch in Santa Fe, but Miller's observations lingered in Xander's mind long after the trail boss had retired for the night. The cattle drive reached Santa Fe without major incident, though not without challenges. A flash flood nearly cost them a dozen head, and a confrontation with rustlers 2 days from their destination resulted in a brief but intense exchange of gunfire. Throughout these trials, Xander performed with the cool efficiency that had kept him alive through years of solitary wandering, earning respect from even the most experienced hands. The sale of the cattle went smoothly, fetching a better price than Miller had anticipated. When the time came to distribute wages, Xander found his share augmented by a bonus. "For the rustlers," Miller explained, "your quick thinking saved us more than just cattle." With his payment secured, Xander faced a decision that would have been unthinkable months earlier rather than continuing his perpetual journey. He purchased supplies for the return to Stein's Pass and the Calloway Ranch. Among his purchases was a small silver locket for Elizabeth, a practical pocketknife for Thomas, and a leather-bound journal for Jasmine, having noticed her writing in the evenings by lamplight. The return journey felt both longer and more purposeful than any in Xander's memory. As he approached the familiar landscape surrounding Stein's Pass, anticipation built within him not just to deliver the much-needed money, but to see the faces that had begun to mean something beyond mere acquaintance. It was late afternoon when Xander crested the final rise overlooking the Calloway property. From this distance, he could see smoke rising from the chimney, cattle grazing in the western pasture, and a small figure he recognized as Thomas mending the chicken coop. The scene was ordinary, domestic, and stirred emotions Xander had long believed dormant. As he rode closer, Thomas spotted him, abandoning his task to race toward the house, shouting excitedly. By the time Xander reached the yard, Jasmine and Elizabeth had emerged, the little girl bouncing with barely contained excitement while her mother stood more composed, though her expression betrayed similar emotion. "Mr. Xander," Elizabeth cried, rushing forward as he dismounted. "Did you bring stories? Did you see Indians? Did you fight bad men?" Laughing, Xander scooped the child up, surprised by how natural the action felt. "All of that and more, Miss Elizabeth, but first I believe I promised presents." Thomas approached more cautiously, his attempt at manly reserve betrayed by the grin he couldn't quite suppress. "The ranch is secure, sir, just like I promised." "Never doubted it for a minute," Xander replied seriously, setting Elizabeth down and extending his hand to the boy in a man-to-man gesture that made Thomas stand taller. Finally, Xander turned to Jasmine, suddenly uncertain. 3 weeks of separation had not diminished the connection he felt, but rather strengthened it through reflection and anticipation. She looked tired but relieved, her smile warming him more effectively than any campfire on the trail. "Welcome back," she said simply. Those 2 words, spoken with genuine feeling, resonated more deeply than any elaborate greeting. Xander had been welcomed to countless places during his years of wandering, but never had the phrase carried such meaning. "Good to be back," he replied, the understatement deliberate but understood. That evening, after the excitement of gifts and trail stories had subsided, and the children reluctantly went to bed, Xander and Jasmine sat at the kitchen table counting out the money from the cattle drive. Combined with what Jasmine had managed to save, it was enough to cover the bank loan with a small amount remaining. It buys us time, Jasmine said, relief evident in her voice. But Hargrove won't stop. And next season. She trailed off, the constant struggle for survival momentarily overwhelming her optimism. I've been thinking about that, Xander said carefully. The ranch has potential, but it needs investment, better breeding stock, irrigation for the south pasture, repairs to the outbuildings. Jasmine looked at him curiously. That would take money we don't have. I have savings, Xander admitted. Not a fortune, but enough to make a start, if we were partners. The proposal hung between them, its implications extending far beyond a simple business arrangement. Jasmine studied him, her expression thoughtful. Partners, she repeated. You're proposing to stay then, permanently? Xander nodded slowly. If you'll have me. As a partner, Jasmine clarified, her tone carefully neutral. To begin with, Xander replied, equally careful. The rest would be up to you, in time. A small smile touched Jasmine's lips, genuine but tinged with caution born of hard experience. Time we can manage. It seems we've bought some. The following day they rode together to Stein's Pass, the children left in the care of a neighboring rancher's wife. Their first stop was the bank, where they paid Clayton's loan in full. The teller's surprise at Jasmine's ability to meet the obligation barely concealed behind professional courtesy. Next came the general store, where they settled outstanding accounts and purchased supplies. Olson regarded Xander with newfound respect, clearly reassessing his initial judgment of the drifter who had appeared in town weeks earlier. Heard you did well on the cattle drive, the storekeeper commented as he wrapped their purchases. Also heard you're staying on at the Calloway place. News travels fast, Xander observed dryly. Olson chuckled. Small town. Not much happens that everyone doesn't know about by sundown. As they loaded their supplies into the wagon Jasmine had brought, Hargrove's buggy pulled up in front of the bank across the street. The businessman spotted them immediately, his expression darkening as he realized the implications of their presence in town. Trouble, Xander murmured, nodding toward Hargrove, who was now striding purposefully in their direction. Mrs. Calloway, Hargrove greeted with forced cordiality. Mr. Masterson, I understand congratulations are in order. The bank tells me you've settled Clayton's debt. That's right, Jasmine confirmed, her tone polite but firm. The Calloway ranch is secure. Hargrove's smile didn't reach his eyes. For the moment, perhaps. Running a ranch is an expensive proposition, as your late husband discovered. My offer still stands. And my answer remains the same, Jasmine replied. The ranch is not for sale, Mr. Hargrove. Not now, not ever. The businessman's facade of civility slipped slightly, revealing the calculation beneath. Everything has its price, Mrs. Calloway. It's simply a matter of finding it. His gaze shifted to Xander, assessing. Or waiting until circumstances change. Again. The veiled threat was not lost on either of them. As Hargrove returned to his business, Xander and Jasmine exchanged glances, both recognizing that their challenges were far from over. The ride back to the ranch was subdued, the confrontation with Hargrove casting a shadow over their earlier satisfaction. As they crested the rise overlooking the Calloway property, Jasmine reined her horse to a stop, gazing thoughtfully at the vista below. My father used to say that land is the only thing that lasts, she said after a moment. People come and go, but the land remains. Xander nodded, understanding the philosophy. My father said something similar. Course, he lost his land in Tennessee during the war, so maybe lasting isn't quite the right word. Jasmine turned to him, her expression curious. You never speak of your family. Not much to tell, Xander replied, the habitual deflection automatic. Then, surprising himself, he continued, Father died at Shiloh, Mother followed a year later. Grief, I think, though they called it fever. I was 16, joined up with the Union forces after that. I'm sorry, Jasmine said quietly. Xander shrugged, uncomfortable with sympathy. Long time ago now. Is that why you've wandered? Because there was nothing to go back to. The question penetrated defenses Xander had maintained for years, forcing him to consider motivations he had deliberately avoided examining. Maybe at first, he admitted. Later, it was just easier to keep moving than to stop. And now? Jasmine asked, her voice soft. Xander looked at her, this woman who had shown more courage and determination in the face of adversity than many men he had known. Now I'm thinking stopping might be worth the risk. The months that followed established a new rhythm to life at the Calloway ranch. With Xander's savings and practical expertise, they began implementing improvements that gradually increased the property's productivity. Better breeding stock improved their small herd, strategic repairs to outbuildings and fences secured the operation against harsh weather, and careful management of their limited resources stretched every dollar. Hargrove remained a looming presence on the periphery of their lives, occasionally renewing his offer for the property, but increasingly focusing on legal maneuvers to control the water rights. Each challenge was met with determined resistance, Jasmine's knowledge of their legal standing complemented by Xander's practical approach to securing their position. As winter approached, bringing cooler temperatures to the New Mexico territory, the relationship between Xander and Jasmine evolved from cautious partnership to deeper connection. The children had long since accepted him as a permanent fixture in their lives, Thomas seeking his guidance in learning ranch operations, while Elizabeth delighted in the stories and small wooden toys Xander carved in rare moments of leisure. Yet despite their growing closeness, certain boundaries remained unspoken between the adults. Xander continued to live in the bunkhouse, though he took most meals with the family and spent evenings by the fireplace, helping Thomas with schoolwork or listening to Elizabeth's increasingly complex imaginative tales. The first significant snowfall of the season came earlier than expected, a mid-November storm that blanketed the landscape in white. Xander had ridden out at dawn to check on cattle in the north pasture, concerned that the sudden temperature drop might affect the more vulnerable animals. The storm intensified while he was out, visibility decreasing rapidly as snow accumulated. By mid-afternoon, when Xander had not returned, Jasmine's concern grew to alarm. She stationed Thomas at the window with instructions to watch for any sign of approach, while she prepared extra blankets and heated water, anticipating potential frostbite or exposure. It was nearly dusk when Thomas's shout alerted her to movement at the edge of the property. Peering through the swirling snow, Jasmine could barely make out Xander's form, hunched against the wind and leading his horse rather than riding. "Stay inside with Elizabeth," she instructed Thomas, wrapping herself in a heavy coat before venturing into the storm. She reached Xander halfway between the house and barn, immediately noting his stiff movements and the unnatural paleness of his exposed skin. Without words, she took the horse's reins in one hand and wrapped her other arm around Xander's waist, supporting him toward the house. "Barn first," Xander managed through chattering teeth. "Horse needs care." "Thomas can see to the horse," Jasmine countered firmly. "You need warmth before frostbite sets in." For once, Xander didn't argue, allowing himself to be guided into the warm kitchen where Elizabeth gasped at his snow-covered appearance, and Thomas immediately volunteered to tend the horse. "Be careful," Xander called after the boy, his concern for Thomas evident despite his own condition. "Take a lantern. Be quick." As Thomas hurried out, properly bundled against the cold, Jasmine helped Xander remove his frozen outer garments. His fingers were worryingly stiff, his face red where it had been exposed to the wind, and his normally composed demeanor betrayed by violent shivering. "Sit by the fire," Jasmine directed, guiding him to the chair closest to the hearth where Elizabeth was already adding another log. "Elizabeth, bring the blankets I prepared." The little girl hurried to comply while Jasmine poured hot coffee, laced with whiskey, a remedy her grandmother had sworn by for exposure to cold. Xander accepted the mug gratefully, his hands trembling slightly as he wrapped them around the warm ceramic. "Cattle?" Jasmine asked, knowing his mind would be on the task even now. "Move them to the sheltered ravine," Xander replied between sips. "Should be protected from the worst of it. Lost track of time, storm came on faster than I expected." Elizabeth returned with an armful of blankets, her small face serious as she helped Jasmine wrap them around Xander's shoulders. The child then climbed onto the arm of his chair, pressing against his side in an instinctive offering of additional warmth that brought a smile to Xander's still pale face. "You're like the ice princess in my story," Elizabeth informed him solemnly. "But you need a magical kiss to break the spell, not just blankets." Jasmine felt heat rise to her cheeks at her daughter's innocent suggestion, but Xander merely chuckled, some of his natural color beginning to return. "Is that so, Miss Elizabeth? And where might I find such magical assistance?" The child giggled, pointing to her mother with absolute certainty. "Mama has the strongest magic. She kisses all hurts better." Thomas's return from the barn saved Jasmine from responding, the boy stamping snow from his boots as he entered, proudly reporting that the horse was properly stabled, fed, and blanketed. The evening passed in unusual domesticity, the storm outside increasing in intensity while the family remained secure within. Jasmine prepared a hearty stew. The children set the table without prompting, and Xander gradually recovered from his ordeal, though occasional shivers suggested the cold had penetrated deeper than he admitted. When it came time for bed, the children were reluctant to leave the cozy kitchen, their normal routine disrupted by both the storm and the lingering worry over Xander's condition. "Perhaps a story first," Jasmine suggested, recognizing their need for reassurance. Something about brave adventurers weathering storms. To her surprise, Xander offered to tell the tale, his deep voice weaving a narrative of courage and perseverance that had the children hanging on every word. As Elizabeth's eyelids began to droop and Thomas fought to stifle yawns, Jasmine realized that Xander had created characters remarkably similar to the children themselves, a brave boy who protected his family, and a clever girl whose imagination helped solve seemingly impossible problems. After the children were finally tucked into bed, Jasmine returned to the kitchen to find Xander still seated by the fire, his expression thoughtful as he gazed into the flames. "You should rest," she said, gathering the empty cups from the table. "You've had quite an ordeal." Xander nodded but made no move to leave. "Been thinking," he said after a moment. "A dangerous pastime for a man recovering from exposure," Jasmine teased gently, taking the seat opposite him. A smile briefly crossed his face before seriousness returned. "Today made me realize something. When I was out there in the storm, not sure if I'd find my way back." He paused, seeming to search for words. "All I could think about was getting back here, to you, to the children." Jasmine felt her heart quicken, sensing the significance of his admission. "We were worried about you too," she said softly. "The children especially." "Only the children?" Xander asked, echoing their exchange from months earlier. This time Jasmine didn't hesitate. "No," she admitted. "Not only the children." Xander leaned forward slightly, his gaze intent. Jasmine, I've spent most of my life avoiding attachments, convincing myself that being alone was simpler, safer. Then I found you and Thomas and Elizabeth, and nothing's been simple since. Is that a complaint? Jasmine asked, suddenly uncertain. It's the opposite, Xander replied, reaching across to take her hand. It's me recognizing that what I thought was freedom was actually just emptiness. And what I found here, with all its complications and challenges, is what I've been looking for without knowing it. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as the storm intensified, yet within the kitchen, a different kind of intensity built between them. Jasmine looked down at their joined hands, his larger one engulfing hers, and felt a certainty she had not expected to experience again after Clayton's death. "The children adore you," she said softly. "And I've come to love them as my own," Xander replied, his voice equally quiet. "But it's not just the children, Jasmine, it's you. Your strength, your determination, your heart. I love you, and if you'll have me, I'd like to build a life here with all of you." Tears pricked at Jasmine's eyes, unexpected emotion welling up at his words. Clayton had been a good man, a kind husband, but their marriage had been built on practical considerations as much as affection. What Xander offered was different, a choice made with full awareness of both the challenges and possibilities. "The ranch is still struggling," she pointed out, practical even in this moment. "Hargrove remains a threat. The future is uncertain." Xander's smile was warm, understanding. Life is uncertain, but facing it together seems like better odds than facing it alone. Rising from his chair, he moved to kneel beside hers, still holding her hand. "Jasmine Calloway, I'm asking to be more than your partner in running this ranch. I'm asking to be your husband, a father to your children, to build something lasting together on this land your husband loved." The simplicity and sincerity of his proposal touched Jasmine deeply. There was no flowery language, no grandiose promises, just an honest offer of shared life, with all its joys and difficulties. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears now flowing freely. "Yes, I will marry you, Xander Masterson." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, tentative in its exploration of new territory, then deepening as months of unstated longing found expression. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the land, but within the warmth of the kitchen, a different kind of weather system had reached its natural conclusion, the long, solitary winter of Xander's wandering yielding to the promise of spring and new beginnings. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Steins Pass, a simple ceremony attended by the children, a few neighboring ranchers who had gradually accepted Xander's presence, and even Jacob Miller, who happened to be passing through on his way to Texas. Hargrove was conspicuously absent, though rumors circulated that he had been seen consulting with lawyers in Santa Fe, suggesting the battle for water rights was far from over. The winter months that followed were characterized by both external challenges and domestic contentment. The harsh weather tested their resources and resilience, but the evenings spent as a family around the fireplace, with Thomas reading aloud from his school books, and Elizabeth creating increasingly elaborate stories about their lives, provided compensation that Xander found more valuable than any gold or silver he had pursued in his wandering days. Sharing Jasmine's bed, waking beside her each morning, learning the rhythms and patterns of family life, these simple pleasures continued to surprise Xander with their depth and meaning. The man who had once measured freedom by the distance he could travel now found satisfaction in the boundaries of responsibility and love. Spring arrived with its characteristic renewal, bringing calving season and the first tentative shoots in Jasmine's garden. The children thrived under the combined influence of their mother's nurturing and Xander's practical guidance. Thomas, now approaching 9, showed increasing aptitude for ranch work, while Elizabeth's natural creativity blossomed in the secure environment of their blended family. It was during this season of growth that Jasmine shared news that completed the circle of renewal. She was expecting a child, due to arrive with the autumn harvest. The announcement, made during a Sunday dinner, was met with varying reactions. Thomas's practical questions about how another child would affect ranch operations, Elizabeth's immediate decision that she wanted a sister and had already selected names, and Xander's momentary stunned silence, followed by joy so profound it left him temporarily wordless. That night, after the children were asleep, Xander held Jasmine close, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. "Are you happy?" she asked, though his earlier reaction had left little doubt. "More than I knew was possible," Xander replied honestly. "When I rode into Stein's Pass last year, I was just looking for temporary work, maybe enough money to continue north. Never imagined I'd find a home, a family, a purpose." Jasmine traced the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "And I never imagined another chance at love after Clayton died. The children and the ranch were my entire focus, survival, not happiness." "And now," Xander prompted. Her smile was answer enough, but she spoke the words anyway. "Now I have both security and joy. The children have a father who teaches them by example about courage and perseverance. And I have a partner who sees me as I am, not as someone to be protected or pitied." The following months brought both anticipated and unexpected developments. Hargrove, true to form, initiated legal proceedings challenging the Calloway Masterson water rights, requiring Xander to make several trips to Santa Fe to consult with a lawyer recommended by Jacob Miller. The case would take time to resolve, but their position was stronger than Hargrove had anticipated, particularly with documentation Jasmine had carefully preserved from Clayton's original purchase of the property. More immediately concerning was Jasmine's pregnancy, which proved more difficult than her previous experiences. The summer heat took a toll on her energy, and by August, the local midwife recommended complete rest, a challenge for a woman accustomed to active participation in ranch operations and household management. Xander adapted, taking on additional responsibilities while ensuring Thomas and Elizabeth maintained their connection with their mother through regular reading sessions, and shared meals in the bedroom where Jasmine was confined. Elizabeth appointed herself nurse, bringing cool cloths and wildflowers, while Thomas solemnly reported each day's ranch activities as if delivering an official ledger. It was during this period of enforced rest that Jasmine began writing more extensively in the journal Xander had given her, recording not just daily events but memories of her childhood in Missouri, her journey west with Clayton, and reflections on the unexpected turns her life had taken. When she shared these writings with Xander in the quiet evenings, he recognized a talent that transcended simple record keeping. Jasmine had a gift for observation and expression that deserved wider appreciation. "You should consider sending some of these to that magazine Thomas brought from town," Xander suggested one evening as Jasmine read a particularly vivid description of a sunrise over the New Mexico desert. "The one that publishes stories and essays about Western life." Jasmine's surprise was evident. Who would be interested in the musings of a rancher's wife? "Anyone who appreciates truth beautifully expressed," Xander replied with conviction. "Your words capture this life in ways fancy Eastern writers never could." Though initially reluctant, Jasmine eventually allowed Xander to send several of her essays to Harper's New Monthly magazine. The waiting period that followed served as distraction during the final weeks of her pregnancy, when discomfort and anticipation made days seem longer and sleep elusive. Alexander Clayton Masterson arrived in early October, a robust boy with a shock of dark hair and lungs that announced his presence to the entire household. His birth was easier than anticipated given the difficult pregnancy, the midwife pronouncing both mother and child healthy within hours. Thomas and Elizabeth were permitted brief visits, their expressions of wonder at their new brother bringing tears to Jasmine's eyes and a tightness to Xander's throat that surprised him with its intensity. That night, with the children finally asleep and the newborn swaddled in his cradle beside their bed, Xander sat watching Jasmine as she dozed. The reality of what they had created together, not just this new life, but the family unit that surrounded him, struck with overwhelming force. For a man who had spent years avoiding connection, the web of relationships that now defined him should have felt constraining. Instead, Xander experienced it as the most profound freedom he had ever known, the freedom to belong, to love without reservation, to build something lasting. The winter of 1879 proved milder than the previous year, allowing ranch operations to continue with minimal disruption. Young Alexander, quickly nicknamed Alex by his siblings, thrived under the combined attention of his family, his good nature evident in ready smiles and an apparently limitless curiosity about his surroundings. Jasmine's health returned steadily, though she maintained a more measured approach to physical labor than before, partly at Xander's insistence and partly due to a new development. Harper's had not only published one of her essays but requested more, offering payment that, while modest, represented recognition of value beyond the boundaries of their ranch. By spring, several significant changes had transformed both their personal and professional prospects. The legal battle with Hargrove concluded unexpectedly when the businessman suffered financial reverses in mining investments, forcing him to abandon his expansion plans and eventually sell his holdings to a corporation based in Denver. The water rights remained secure, removing a shadow that had hung over their future since Xander's arrival. Simultaneously, Jasmine's writing gained increasing attention, with regular publications not only in Harper's but in several regional newspapers. Her honest, unromanticized accounts of frontier life from a woman's perspective filled a niche that resonated with readers both east and west. The additional income, while not substantial, provided a buffer against the inevitable fluctuations of ranching prosperity. Most significantly, the ranch itself showed signs of sustainable growth. Xander's careful breeding program improved their herd, strategic improvements to irrigation increased grazing capacity, and Thomas's emerging skills allowed for more efficient operation with fewer hired hands. What had been a struggling enterprise on the verge of foreclosure was transforming into a viable, though modest, success. On a warm evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, 5-month-old Alex sleeping contentedly in Xander's arms while Thomas and Elizabeth played an elaborate game of their own invention in the yard, Jasmine reached for her husband's free hand. "I received a letter today," she said, her tone suggesting news of significance. "From a publisher in New York. They've read my pieces in Harper's and are interested in a collection essays about women's experiences on the frontier." Xander's pride was immediate and genuine. "That's wonderful. I told you your words mattered." Jasmine nodded, her expression a mixture of excitement and thoughtfulness. "It would mean more writing, possibly even a trip east eventually." "We'll manage," Xander assured her, understanding her concern about adding responsibilities to an already full life. "The ranch is stable now. Thomas is becoming a real hand. We can adjust." Jasmine's smile held a depth of emotion that still caught Xander by surprise. Sometimes the knowledge that this extraordinary woman had chosen him, trusted him, built a life with him. "5 years ago, I would never have imagined this path," she said softly. "When Clayton died, I thought our story was ending, that the rest would just be struggle and eventually defeat." "And now," Xander prompted, echoing their exchange from months earlier. Jasmine gestured toward their children, their home, the land stretching before them in the golden light of sunset. "Now I understand that stories don't end so much as change direction. Clayton's death wasn't the end of our story. It was a turning point that eventually led to you, to Alex, to possibilities I couldn't have envisioned." She squeezed his hand, her gaze direct and loving. "You rode alone for years, Xander Masterson, and I tried to stand alone when I thought I had to. But it turns out we were both wrong about what strength looks like." "How so?" Xander asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "Real strength isn't about facing everything alone," Jasmine said with quiet certainty. "It's about being brave enough to accept help when it's offered. To trust someone else with your heart and future. To build something together that's stronger than what either of us could create separately." As if in agreement, Alex stirred in Xander's arms, his tiny hand reaching up to grasp his father's finger with surprising strength. The simple gesture, this tangible connection to a future extending beyond his own life, filled Xander with profound contentment. "I rode alone because I thought that's all there was," he admitted. "Freedom to go anywhere, answer to no one, carry nothing but what fit in my saddlebags. Took me too many years to realize how empty that kind of freedom is." Thomas called from the yard, proudly displaying a wooden contraption he had constructed, a miniature water wheel, designed to harness the flow of the creek behind the house. Elizabeth danced around it, weaving an elaborate tale about water fairies and magical kingdoms. The ordinary moment, filled with childhood imagination and achievement, struck Xander as extraordinary in its simple perfection. "You know what real freedom is?" he asked, his gaze taking in their children, their home, the life they had built together. "It's this: having somewhere that matters enough to return to, people who see you clearly and love you anyway, work that means something beyond just survival." Jasmine leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched their children play in the fading light. "Then we've found it together," she said softly. "The thing most worth seeking." As darkness settled over the New Mexico landscape, stars emerging in the vast desert sky, Xander Masterson, once a solitary rider with no destination beyond the next horizon, held his family close and knew with absolute certainty that his longest journey had led him exactly where he was meant to be.